Yeah, so I think we're there now. Okay, so right, first of all, Karin, thank you very much for giving me the time to talk about you, your life, your experiences, and yeah. So you suggested that we start with the early years, the really really early years. So when the war ended, if I'm not mistaken, you were about 7 years old. Is this correct?
When it stopped, yes.
Yes. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So do you
I
remember
was
it
born
well?
right into the war, yes. Before the war.
Yeah. How do you remember it? I mean, those early years, because sometimes it's difficult, isn't it, to have a proper recollection of things? But I mean, in those traumatic times,
You
did you?
remember very much.
Yeah.
You remember a lot. I remember details. My mother didn't remember. My father didn't remember. And I was only 3 or 4 years old. That's because you have to grow up very quickly in those stressful times. The thing is that I was born in Dortmund, but we lived in Reit. And Reit was one of the main targets of the British Air Force because of business and industry, because of also that some major Nazis were born there. I think that helped find the target. So the first thing I remember is bombardments, the lights flashing from above and from below, the flak responding to the bombs from up in the sky. As a child, I didn't refuse to, but I complained about having to leave my bed all the time and go down into the basement for protection. There were some near misses, but they didn't scare me. What scared me most was when my 2-year younger brother couldn't be awoken by my mother, and she said, "Here, hold the baby. I go and get some water." And for that was my most frightful experience of the war. For a long time, I was slightly afraid of what was happening, the noise and the light and the bombs. And we had 7 bombs in the house we lived in. But after a while, I wasn't anymore, because a friend of my father, he bowdlerized a German song or fairy tale of the mountain of rice where you could hide. So I was always hiding in the mountain of rice and nobody could touch me. We were evacuated the children and the mothers were evacuated. We were evacuated to Thuringia, which in the beginning was liberated by the Americans. So my first experience with Americans was a mixture of friends who gave us chocolates and took us for rides in the tanks. I was 6 then. I'd been to school for half a year and then evacuated, and then so I must have been about 6. And so I lost all kinds of fears of people from different parts of the world, because after the Americans had gone, the Russians came in. And we were lucky that we had a Russian colonel in the house who also spoiled the children. So whenever I came with my little dirndl and the apron, I had to lift up the apron, and I would get all kinds of very nice cheeses, not chocolates, but cheeses, which was much healthier, because that was cheese that were also working against all kinds of diseases. You know, it was a positive experience. I cannot say anything else. So I got out of that fairly unscathed, and we were all lucky because my immediate family got out without any wounds or any traumas. Plus, I was lucky that my immediate family had nothing to do with the Nazis. So when I was about 12, I started wondering what had happened, because Jewish friends of my mother's and my uncles came to visit us, and I loved those women. There were two women, and they had been neighbors of my father's and my uncle's, and I adored them. I felt closer to them than to my own aunts. So it became a personal thing. It became a personal wanting to know what happened, because I heard that their 19-year-old brother had been shot. Their parents had been gas chambered, and I couldn't fathom my then just born brother, that anybody would want to hurt him, and I wouldn't start screaming. So I asked my mother. There were the first paperback essays on Nazism and research on Nazism, and I was 12, and I got them for a present. So that's when I started to really get into it. And that was another thing of wanting to get out, because you could trust your parents, you could not even trust all your family members. And as a child, that's very important that you have trust. And I couldn't trust some of the friends, parents, or my parents' friends. So it was always, I wanted to get out. I wanted to get away. I wanted to get into a different environment where I could trust. So
just to clarify for a few people, Thuringia was then therefore in the eastern.
It was in the east, yes.
Former East Germany, yeah.
Yes, okay. Weimar and so on. We were in Gotha. So we made it back into the west, into North Rhine-Westphalia, where we had lived, and moved into a ruin of a house of my grandparents. My parents made it livable in some parts again, and we stayed there until 1959, when there were two bungalows built in the garden, and this house could be torn down. It had served us, our family, my parents, my two brothers and myself, my grandparents, and an uncle very well right after the war. And it wasn't not a loss. It was a huge house. It was a lovely house. My mother always said, I shouldn't say it, but I'm glad it's gone, because we would have been stuck in this beautiful big house with a lot of other people, and we wouldn't have had our own realm, so to speak. Anyway, I tried to get out as much as I could. I was one of the first to get into an exchange of students, of pupils with Finland. This was in 1954. 2 years later, I had the chance of going to England to spend about 4 or 5 months at an English school in Northumberland, in staying with a family, and it was wonderful. When I came back, I had to catch up on what I had lost in the German school system, but I'd gained so much more in the English school system, and with the experience of something else, and lovely people, and lots of help, and total trust. It was always a matter of trust. So I came back and I did finish my school, and I went into general studies for about a year. My father said, okay, you can play around for a year. but then you have to decide. And I started with German studies, with history of arts and philosophy, and without really being able to analyze what was going on, I had a very strange feeling, because particularly in the German literature courses, there were things like, there was beautiful French literature in the Middle Ages, but it was the Germans who gave them depth. And I thought, who? What is that? What depth could Germans give to another country's Minnesang poetry? And I took step by step. I got out of Germanistics in Germany, and later discovered, of course, the brown Nazi, not the Nazi past of these professors, but they had been taught during the Nazi period. And that had a strong effect on their thinking and their priorities. And that wasn't my field. I loved literature, and I later went back into it, but in America, not in Germany. And I decided, okay, in Germany, I will do something practical. I learn languages. I go to the Dolmetscher translator school of the University of Heidelberg, which I did. After about 3 semesters, it became relatively boring. It was the same thing over and over again. It was always somebody else thinking and speaking, and I only had to rethink and repronounce what they had been doing. So I went to I had law as a minor. I went to my law professor and said, I have to get out of here. It's killing me, otherwise I won't finish. And he said, we have a very nice lady in Texas at Rice University, and her term is finished in 3 months. Why don't you apply? And I was lucky. I got the scholarship, and I still have the feeling this is because of the report card I got from the English school, which had one sentence which was more important than all the grades. She's very sociable. This also got me a Fulbright travel grant. I'm absolutely sure that this sentence made the difference. So I got 2 scholarships to go to America, and of course I went. And I spent a year of intense experiences and lovely experiences, sad experiences, because I was in Texas and I hadn't realized what was happening in America, something that we now have been experiencing again. Racism. All of Rice University had no blackface. One black person from South Africa was allowed to use the library. All the other black faces were janitors. Everybody teaching and studying at Rice University was white. There were some Asians. But then I learned, of course, what had kept the Texans the way they were. They were among the ones who had the grandfather clause and the poll tax and all kinds of other restrictions for voting. People couldn't vote if their grandfather had been a slave. They couldn't vote if they didn't have money for the poll tax, which wasn't levied from the whites. So all of these things kind of mixed together was a very, very intense experience. And I must say, I grew up, I was happy, I was sad, And actually, I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to go back. But of course, I did go back. My parents were waiting for me. I was homesick for them. And I had promised my father, if you stop your studies in translation, now you have to come back and finish it. And I did.
I mean, the American angle is something that I really would like to get into, because I think that there are lots of experiences that you had there which you intimate, which, as you said, I think meaningfully that these are things that we have been experiencing, particularly for the last couple of years, but I think in many parts of the world they've never stopped experiencing these things. But I also want to go back a bit to speak about the post-war years in Germany, because luckily you said that none of your immediate family were involved with the years, the Nazi years from 1933 to 45. So it's not perhaps as difficult for you to look back, but looking back at the rebuilding years, the years after the war, and the government, so Adenauer's government immediately after the war, which was, the cabinet was sort of 50% formed of Nazis. How hard was this rebuilding culture? How hard was it for the people to sort of settle into a new reality?
Remember, I was 7 when the war was over, which meant you start thinking. In my case, I started researching, in quotation marks, when I was 12. It took some time before I was adult enough to think in terms of politics. This was experience, life's experience. This was not politics, what I'd seen before. I knew my father had absolutely kept me from being drawn into any kind of youth groups, what have you. My father was never required to go into the army because he had a hip problem. So in that sense, I didn't have the direct contact with a lot of things that maybe even my uncles, my grandfathers were involved in or had contact with. That I learned after I was 40. As far as my grandfathers were concerned, one was very, very religious and very, very loving. But I discovered that there was a portrait of his with the Iron Cross. And not the Iron Cross, the Nazi cross. Mm-hmm. And
the swastika, the Hakenkreuz.
The swastika, yes, yeah. The swastika. It was taken off the picture that I had, but I saw it in somebody else's home. So it took me. And a couple of years before, I had asked my aunt to use a tape recorder and tell about her childhood. And she was talking about her father, my father's father. And she recalled that after the 20s, both our families had lost their factories. They had textile. They were into textile. So my father's father had joined the SA before 33 in 28 because he thought he would have a better chance of getting a position as a manager in Holland in a company. He had nothing basically to do with the Nazis. It was just opportunism, and it made me sick. So that realization came much, much later than my my political thinking. Political thinking was initiated in America.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But do you remember the rebuilding years? So, as in you going to school, for example, in those years, how much? So you mentioned that a lot of the textbooks, for example, were still perhaps dominated in some ways by Nazi ideology, but the general mood of the other students, was it like, was there still
there were
a fear
fights.
of bombs? Yeah, sorry, please.
There were fights between us because I had a Jewish family, so to speak, and they were starting with the anti-Semitism that they had heard at home. So it was you could either fight or you could shut up. And at first I fought and made my point, and then I thought it's not worth it. I'm going to keep out of that problem, but it's there. What was also there was the opportunism of some families. They made money out of the disaster of others. And in school, it was when I got into secondary school, we had one school building for the boys and the girls, but a boys' school and a girls' school separated. So either we had classes in the morning or we had classes in the afternoon. We were not supposed to either mingle or meet with the boys. That was, we took it for granted. It was a time for about, I would almost say 6 or 7 years after coming out of the war, that we enjoyed being children again, not thinking, not being afraid, not analyzing everything, or having responsibilities for our small brothers and sisters, or for our parents. You kind of were made responsible for everything at a very young age during that time. So for quite a number of years, I was simply a child, and I don't remember very much of that time. I remember more of the time when during the war and shortly after the war.
Okay, so from the age of 12 on is perhaps where you're...
Yes. Okay.
And
this is when, but there it was in the beginning was totally geared toward anti-Semitism, or the fight of anti-Semitism. I didn't know what the fact that Adenauer had taken over one of the lawyers who had annotated the laws against Jewish against the marriage between Jews and non-Jews. Globke went to Bavaria for to be absolved of everything, and then came back, and Adenauer took him into his cabinet. And this, of course, happened to some other people. That I only learned much later. You know, these things were not talked about in my parents' circles, because my parents were basically non-political, and the people around them were non-political because they didn't want to divulge what they had done.
So it was convenient for those others to be non-political.
Yes. Yeah, but that was the point where I had the lack of trust.
Yeah. I mean, it's the post-war days are fascinating for so many different reasons. But it's important for me to gauge the sort of the social side of things. You know, how people would face such an extreme reality on one day, and then thereafter that reality has been quickly removed from their lives. And you mentioned also that you really enjoyed your trip to the UK, where you went to, is it Northumberland, you said?
Yes.
Yeah.
Newcastle.
Newcastle. Okay. And yeah, how was that for you? I mean, could you speak English before you went to the UK?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
First of all, I was Anglophile before I had my first lesson of English, because our friends had fled to the States. My mother's friends had, one family was in the States, the other one was in Leicester. And of course, when I met them and their children spoke English, a bit of German, but not very much. And I wanted to communicate with them on their level, not on mine. And this is, plus my father was in Japan for 4 years, from 1932 to 1936. And he spoke terrible pidgin English, but he did speak it. And my mother, of course, had also had 6 years of English in school. And she could understand quite a bit. So there was English around me. And of course, when I started English in high school at 10, so by the time I got into high school at 10, I knew some English. And then between high school and the English experience, I had 6 years of English in high school. So it was, plus if you really like it, you learn a lot, even while the others don't.
Absolutely. Okay, so then that means you went to the UK when you were 18?
16.
16, okay.
No, I'm sorry, 17.
And how was the reception there then? So, okay, obviously this one line that you mentioned suggests how friendly you were, but the first few weeks, your introduction into life there, and how receptive were the Brits basically to this German guy?
Very easy. I was with family. He was, the father was a lawyer. The mother was a housewife with 2 children. They had invited me. I was their au pair, and they really, really pulled me into their life and into the life of their friends. There was no resentment. There was some questions when I was in school. Of course, there came a German girl, so shortly after the war, and of course there were a number of Jewish pupils who had quite a different kind of experience, and they knew they had lost their family by the Nazis and so on. So there was a standoff for a while, and then it went away totally. I don't know why.
Did you then befriend them? Did you communicate with them?
I communicated with them. Of course, in 4 months, you have a very few very close friendships, particularly. We were living outside of Newcastle, or at the edge of Newcastle. The school was in Gosforth. And you didn't have the daily communication outside of school with a lot of people. There were 2 friends who really, really became close. One was 18 and she could drive, so she took us to Hadrian's Wall and so on and so forth. And of course, that was very, very exciting. But more exciting was that 10 years later, I met her by chance at Borkum, a German island off the north coast. She was there with friends of a family, and I was there with my uncle. And all of a sudden, we were back together again. It was in coincidence, but that was lovely. So that's the one friendship that stayed, except with the friendship with the family, the strange family, and the youngest daughter, who was 2 years younger than I. She came to visit me in Germany, and we showed her around, spoiled her as much as we could.
So on the basic human level, your experiences after, I don't know, how many years, 10 years after the war, 11 years after the war, when you went to the UK, were completely positive. Everybody was, very welcoming. You were able to establish friendships which lasted for years.
I was lucky. Probably because I had friends who spoke for me. There was no, I actually never had experienced, or never experienced afterwards, any anti-Jewish, anti-German resentment, except maybe for the first couple of seconds. I was never, other people were talking about, being called Nazis and so on. I was lucky. I never had to go through that.
And just another quick question. And then just after the war, there were the Nuremberg trials. This occurred while you were still too young to process the significance of the event. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. The whole ramification of it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, I knew that they happened. I knew that some of the major Nazis were executed. I think I remember that I wasn't quite sure whether one should take a life or a life, but I could understand that. And if other people said, they should be killed, I didn't hold it against them. No, it kind of happened, and I realized it was happening, but it didn't really touch me the way it would have 10 years later.
Okay, all right. And so after your trip to the UK, and so therefore, as you suggested before, you wanted to be out and about. You didn't want to stay sort of, sitting down in Germany where you were. You wanted to be moving around, and the opportunity arose through your university contacts to go to Texas. This was in 1959, 1960.
61, the year Kennedy was voted in.
Yeah, how was first of all the cultural change? So between Germany, the UK, you were there for a few months, I suppose. So it's not quite as easy to compare. But between Germany and the USA, how were your experiences in differentiation between these two places?
I didn't have a culture shock at all. I had more of a culture shock when I went to Britain 20 years later.
Okay.
But we can talk about that later.
Yes, of course, yeah. Okay.
No, it was easy. Plus, if you are at a university college, it's a different world. The only families I met were through my roommate and her friends. So it was kind of a secure environment, as long as the girls, I was in a girls' college, as long as they accepted you, and they did.
And this is Houston, yeah? So obviously it's a large city.
It's a large city. It was Rice University. Rice had just been changed from its status from institute to university, and they had some 1,600 students, and per 6 students, they had one full PhD professor. Mm-hmm. So it was the ideal setup. You couldn't but learn.
Mm, okay. I mean, have you read the book Hidden Figures, or are you familiar with the movie?
Nein, no.
Oh, okay. It's fascinating reading. It's about a group of women who essentially help in the development of the NASA, but also
Yes,
in
sorry. Yeah,
yes.
now I remember what you mean. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All
Hmm.
right. Yeah, because they allude to, I mean, the book alludes a lot to the struggle that these women faced, either because they were women or because of their ethnic origins in being black, the difficulties that they faced in accessing, education, and not only good education, but then advanced or further education. So therefore, I mean, in Houston, you're saying that there was an entire institute which became a university dedicated to female students.
No. We had 4 male colleges and 1 women's
Okay.
college. So it was it had men and women. It was not just it was a university with access from both sides.
Mm.
I was very, very curious, and we had some sponsors or mentors, and I once met one of the women, and I said, "Could you arrange for us? I have a group of 5 or 6 people who would like to go with me. I'd like to see the Black College, the Black University, because Houston University was all black, and I was uncomfortable with being in an all-white school, although quite a number of my friends were in the first sit-ins. That was the sit-in 1960. There were still sit-ins.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't participate, but I could try and find some bond money once they were thrown into prison. I wasn't very successful because I didn't have the contacts. But this woman, when I asked her, could she arrange that we see the Black University, she looked at me and she said, "You're the first who ever thought of that. Of course I can." So she made it possible for us to go and meet a history professor, his students, and a lot of other students at the college, at the university. And it was another America. It was uppity up. The students at Rice University were either rich or they were bright and got scholarships. So there was no medium in that. There was no normalcy in that setup. But it was such a normal setup in that Black University. You met people from all walks of life, and once they saw that others approached you without fear, they did too. So again, I was lucky.
So as in the students of the Black University in Houston were also receptive to you, as in there was no animosity or sort of staring contest or sort of
No.
Distance, no?
They were absolutely floored that somebody from Rice would come and want to see them.
And what was your interaction with them like? What did you talk about? Do you remember any of the topics that you spoke with them about?
I don't think we spoke about racism. We didn't speak about the racist methods in Texas because there were quite a few. We talked about the general situation, and then they started asking questions about where we came from. That was more important because they didn't get out as much as the others, so they were interested. I had a Chinese friend with me. I had an Indian friend with me, a male student, and a an Iranian woman. So, you know, there was all of a sudden there was some kind of world coming together.
So
And that was,
were any of you of Anglo-Saxon descent, of this group that you took with you?
no, we were foreign students.
All of you were foreign students.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. My roommate would have gone right away. She probably was in some kind of exams and so on and so forth. But there were quite a number who would have gone with us if we had opened it up or if we had made a big deal about it. No, it was just foreign students, and this is probably also why we were received so well. But in the things that floored me, that really, really shook me, was when I heard that in Texas, in Houston, the school board had taken a book out of the library of kindergarten because it had a white rabbit marry a black rabbit. The Mendel theory of, you know, mixed children and so on. They were not allowed to read that in the library, in the kindergarten, or being read to. Mm-hmm. And another thing was that Catcher in the Rye was forbidden at quite a number of colleges. Not at Rice, but at quite a number of colleges. And that kind of, these little items were put together into some kind of mixed picture of America. I loved America because I'd such a good time there. I learned so much, but at the same time, I was very much aware of what was going on. And that was intensified later when I was living in America.
I mean, I think we're going to have more than just this one discussion, Karin, because I really want to get into not only the social, not only the political, but also some of the other elements, the perhaps in some cases strategic, in some cases psychological, and it's simply the basic human interactions and relations of the experiences that you've had, because there are many. On many different sort of levels. So I also want to talk about your experiences with gender equality. I want to talk about your other experiences with different cultures and so on. But again, I don't want to rush through them, because you are a lovely person. I know, because I've got to know you personally, and on top of that, you are a fascinating wealth of information and knowledge. And it's extremely personalized, the way that you talk about it, and I love that. And so this is why I'd like to speak with you on as many occasions as you will allow me to do so. But something you just touched on there strikes me as being also important today. So in 1960, and obviously this is perhaps a strategy or a policy that had existed before then. So prior to 1960 as well. This idea of controlling media, literature, learning to prevent people from having certain kinds of ideas, to slow down perhaps this dormant human intellectual form of processing the possibilities of human interaction, by not allowing certain kinds of literature, certain ideas to flow freely, even in educational institutions. And this is also something that we touch on in modern life through a different medium called the internet, and misinformation, or the control of information. And it strikes me as amazing that, the 60 years apart, technology is a world apart, and yet the aims are perhaps almost identical.
For me to understand Trump was relatively easy, because I'd been to Texas. In Texas, you were not allowed to teach anything about communism, and you were not allowed to talk or teach about the United Nations. And when Trump left all kinds of aspects of the United Nations, I had an aha, that's where it comes from. It was something that was more exposed in Texas than in some other southern states. But Trump had a lot of contacts to Texas, and he was protecting the oil industry and so on and so forth. So that's where it came from. And I could understand why. I couldn't understand why, but I could understand that it was so. So there was an arc between 1960 and 2020, very strong. There, many things were still there that I recognized in a minor position and as a young student, and rediscovered with more political insight and more life experience these last years. So I wasn't really surprised that there were rightist tendencies in America, that there were vigilante groups. I'd met quite a number of them in one way or another. Began with the Nazis, the Nazi organizations that were international, but also very strong in America. So I'd seen rednecks threatening free speech when I was at Rice, not at Rice, but when I was at Cincinnati, and was representing the Goethe Institute at the University of Cincinnati, and had a Jewish filmmaker who had been in exile in Switzerland come with 2 of his documentary films on Nazism. And of the 16 German associations in Cincinnati, there was a 17th, and that was the Umbrella. And the head of the Umbrella was a Herr von Riestenberg, who called me and said, you cannot have this guy there with the films. That's all lies, that's fake news. He didn't use the word fake news. He said those are lies. Irving has said that is not true. The camps weren't true and the deaths weren't true. So, as I said, I don't scare easily. I said, I'm sorry, but of course we're going along. I went into the auditorium, and there were some 400 American students. And in the middle, right in one row, a row of 20 rednecks. You could see them. They were there present. They showed their presence. And then the film started, and the first film started, and it had the liberation of the Auschwitz camp with all the very, very detailed pictures of bodies and so on. And they started arguing. We want to say something, this is not true, and so on and so forth. And Liza, the film director, went up on stage once one of the films broke, and he asked them again to told them again to ask their question, and they reiterated that question, and he said, "Gentlemen, I have shown this film to Nazis of the highest order who are still living in Germany, and not one questioned the truth of every picture of this. And some were even taken by the Nazis." So this whole row almost, you could see them sink into the chair. They couldn't respond. There was no response. And that taught me a lot, that with a strong back, you can push back all that shit better than with screaming.
I am, I want to put, I'd love actually that word or that sentiment of yours to be the concluding element of this first conversation. And that last part that you referred to, so Cincinnati was a part of your life from 1967 to 75. And I can imagine that you've got a number of...
77.
77, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I can imagine there are some wonderful stories as well that you can add to that. But yeah, I mean, so after we've sort of concluded this first bit, then we can start to plan as to when we can get together again for our next session. Yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on being able to express these things after such a long time has passed? Do you sense the need perhaps to tell your story as well to people? Because there are lots and lots of people, my generation, me included, who have not been privy to these details. Sometimes I listen to a podcast or I read a book, and I'm flailing about in the dark because, as much as I like to think that I'm enlightened and open-minded, there are just so many details which elude me because I was not there. I didn't experience it. I didn't see it. And I think, by listening to your words, the way that you tell your tale, it gives me valuable insight. Is that something that you would like to, perhaps also contribute to this mass of information, but that valuable information which can only come from your presence at the time?
Let me be truthful. I wasn't quite sure how I would talk, what I would say, because I didn't want to talk. In a way, I have a hard time talking about myself. And since very few people here are interested in going through that period again, many of them have never gone through that period again, and intellectually. I have one or two people I could talk to openly. And when we started, without really deciding, I couldn't be but open. Because I'm not. It doesn't serve any purpose to not be open. And whatever other purposes it serves are fine with me. And I don't, even if I open myself to counterattacks or whatever by whoever. As I said, if you have a strong back and if you're not afraid, you can push back.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that the people who listen to this will not in any way be overly critical or critical at all. Essentially, I don't think there's anything that you have said here which anybody could push back against unless they've been there, unless they have experienced it.
I'm as I said, I'm not afraid, and you never know in these times what comes from the other side, and there is always another side. But let's forget about that.
Sure.
Let's simply go on talking.
Absolutely.
Again and again.
Absolutely.
You have I know I have your ear and you have my voice.
This is a wonderful way of putting it, and I'm so grateful. As in, ever since the possibility came about that we would be able to have this series of conversations. I've really been looking forward to just getting started. And it's essentially been a real exercise in self-control, because I wanted to email you almost every day. How's it going? How's the technology coming along? Has somebody got your computer going? But I also know that it's just not possible to continuously badger you. I know that you had some.
No, I'm free now.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm free now. No problem.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
I may even be able to enter the whole system again the next time.
That would be fantastic. Absolutely. Okay, so let me bring this first sort of introductory podcast to an end, and then if you give me a moment, then we will be able to talk about planning the next one. But just for this particular episode, Karin, thank you very much. You are fascinating to listen to, and yeah, your openness is brilliant.
Don't butter me up.
I can't help it. I'm sorry. You deserve it. Brilliant. Okay. So yeah, thank you. What can I say?
You're welcome. No, thank you, because you got me talking. I didn't want to. I wasn't quite sure whether I'd be that open, but you got me talking. Thank you.
A pleasure. Absolute pleasure.